an incident comes to mind I spent about a week out of my life on. It requires a little bit of background information to get into it. The point of all this particular incident is to provide just a wonderful anecdote, I think, of how Tommy functioned, how Tommy made decisions, how intuitively and rapidly and feelingfully he made them sometimes. And this is a kind of a long and winding tale, but it says an awful lot about Tommy in relation to the north of the province. That in Saskatchewan in those days, and I presume it's not much different today, but from the minute I arrived there, I began to realize, well, the way in which the civil service, whatever department, thinks about this province is kind of schizophrenic. They've got a certain set of policies and programs that are relevant to the local improvement districts and the municipalities and the cities of the surveyed southern half of the province, which is probably less than half. But the northern part of the province, which was distinguishable by the survey lines, like surveys had been done to the northern edge of the south of the province, and the survey line at the southern end of the north of the province, and that of course would change as more survey work was done. That line was established by how far the registered surveys by the land department specified. So it was a border that was in flux, of course. The north, from the beginnings of Tommy's administration, had been a special problem. Nothing much had been there in terms of services in the north before Douglas took over. And when I got there, he had programs in the north for 15, 16 years. In his mind, as he would talk about the north again and again, he was full of questions. Like many of his biographers look back on stuff that went on during that 15 years, and they pass all kinds of judgments. The latest one, a publication out of UBC Press by a guy I know, a nice guy, whose name was, Queering. Oh my God, the images in that book about who Tommy was and had been and what he stood for in the north was so far off. Certainly the northern programs were very primitive, and they were varied and they were experimental. And certainly those first 15 years of Tommy's administration, his focus had to be on the south of the province. It was getting grid roads through the province, it was getting power through the province, it was getting business and industry and policies about everything from mining to cooperative functioning, where the main part of the population was in the surveyed area of the province. And the north, as it was called, there's a kind of a postscript at the end of that. For many years before I got there, I'm not sure how many years, at least about 10, most of the activity in the north, again, it varied between the east side was called the east side in the north, and the west side. And most of the east side ran under a kind of, maybe, sort of, single agency administration out of Prince Albert that was operated by, well, the main man was a man called MacDonald, but the deputy of the Department of Natural Resources in Regina was Wilf Churchman, and this guy was a powerhouse. He had a great range of programs throughout the south of the province. He was an excellent administrator. he could always keep his numbers untangled and be able to present reports that would stand up in the legislature. And he was a very competent deputy that made a lot of Tommy's ministers of natural resources look good, and that's what a deputy is there for. He worked well with minister in a way. He posed as an apolitical figure, but from our earliest discussions about the North, Tommy would keep urging me, go over and rattle that around with Churchman and see what he's thinking about all that. Like, Tommy kind of listened to Churchman, and he did as he was told, and he realized at some point maybe we're going to get really into this. But he had tongue-in-cheek about a lot of stuff that was happening in the North, and it was a lot of what Tommy responded to in the base of interest that he worked from when I came bleating into his office on the occasion of my resignation from the Adult Education Division, yelling and screaming about a lot of the things that the province was not doing in the North and some of the things that it was doing in the North. All right, the particular area, well, the east side and the west side were very, very different. But on the east side and the north, all kinds of experiments had been done with the cooperative movement through the Department of Natural Resources at first, and then later involving the co-op department. And there was a lot of emphasis placed on fish marketing boards and fur marketing boards that were kind of, I think, established by DNR and that operated with a degree of success, working with the Indians to move from the good old days of trading fish and furs with the Hudson Bay or whoever, to doing that with the help of government to provide the markets into Chicago, into the eastern seaboard of the United States, where there were strong fish markets and there were some fur outlets as well. So the Fur Marketing Board and the Fish Marketing Board kind of held together the economics of what a lot of these production cooperatives were doing in the North, and most of those were the membership, the workers, the production was done by status Indian people or by Métis who lived in the North and knew only the North. But with the superimposition of Department of Natural Resources officers, DNR officers who lived in small communities and functioned in small areas with a great degree of competency and incompetency. A lot of these were wonderful young men who came off the campus or somewhere and wanted to go work in the North or wanted to work in fish and game and fur-related activities, and became DNR officers, trained briefly in one way or another by Churchman's administration, and then they get dumped down fairly, well, cold and green in the Northern Committee, and most wonderful things would happen, typical things. A young DNR officer, a year or two before I got there, had been plunked down in one of the east side, very isolated communities, and he would keep touch through the government radio occasionally with their administration in Prince Albert. And how's it going up there? Well, having a big problem with this little old widow lady who lives out at the end of town in a little cabin. What's the problem with the lady? Well, the locals keep stealing her wood, and she was out of wood when I got here. What did you do about that? Well, I took my skidoo and my chainsaw, and I had to go 6 miles out of the community because everything is back from these communities. You got to go a long way before you find a living tree. They've been stripped off over 50 years, I guess. And so he went out and he harvested a bunch of small trees and chopped them up cut them down into the right size to fit her stove, and all the stuff back into town, and diligently at 20 below with the wind, piled it up and along, tucked up against her cabin, and the little old lady was smiling from ear to ear, and her fire was going, and he was a hero, and he felt good about what he was doing, and so did she, and he was glad he was in the north. And then a few days later, he reported back, I went out to see how things were going with her, and the locals had stolen all the wood from the front of her cabin. And she was back to being freezing again, and not enough wood. She only had a few pieces of wood there by the fire, and I went out and I did it again. And I piled it there again, and this morning I went by, and half of it's gone again. And the supervisor at the other end laughed like hell.
But, okay.
So at the end of various discussions with neighbors and people who he was learning to say hello to, he realized what the mores, the habits of the community were. And he got his first glimpse that this is a community, is a place where people share in the north, and it's been that way for a long, long time before the white guys arrived. And that he didn't really need to sweat himself about getting wood for little old ladies, because everybody would be very pleased to see him contributing to the communal wood supply. But on the other hand, they had their own ways of dealing with problems like that. And on many levels, the customs of the Northern Cree, essentially, they went rooted way back into the days of the Hudson Bay Company and the traders, and back before that. Many of their thought forms, many of their articulations weren't in a Cree that had been assimilated into the white man's language, and therefore all kinds of new words and new thoughts move over and are given Cree sounds. But the Northern Cree in many places was much more indigenous and exciting from my point of view, and challenging. Okay, so these guys, many of them were sensitive enough to come out of the north with wonderful stories about their own experience and realizations. And if they were there long enough, they became community development oriented to some extent, but then they were now in this superstructure created essentially out of the deputy minister's office over a lot of years in consultation with his people, where a bureaucracy would come in with its expertise and its knowledge of markets and its abilities to develop markets, its knowledge of equipment and its abilities to provide equipment. And they had the East Side pretty well organized in bureaucratic, top-down, administrative, white-originated schemes and methodologies. And oh man, once a year, the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians, with a little grant we had from the province, would bring in from all of the north, all of the unsurveyed area, which would be 20,000, 30,000 Indian Métis people scattered all over this huge, huge area. These people would come in for a week or 10 days with their problems, and the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians would consult with them in Cree, Chip, and Saulteaux. Everything that went on in this room of 50, 60, 80 people would be translated. From every 5 minutes there'd be the translators would bob up, and whatever was going on would be put into Cree, into Chippewa, and into Lesotho, and and then you come back to the English again, and away you go. Oh my goodness! And the stories, the horror stories of mix-ups and misunderstandings and maladministrations, and things that were working sometimes that would flow into these meetings. They were astounding, and I would keep records very, very closely of everything that went on, everything that came out by way of problems were turned into resolutions, and we would come out of every one of these Federation of Saskatchewan Indian meetings with probably 200 recommendations, resolutions that came from way far somewhere up in the north, that originated with the people, and the representatives who came down came bearing these messages. It was democracy at work in a wonderful way. The only thing was, nobody had ever done much with these resolutions, and I would like a little later to talk about how we utilize some of that material. But there we have this background, and as Tommy and I got more and more into brainstorming and thinking about what might happen in the North, there was the realization that a lot of these programs had not yet found their way over to the northern western, to some of the western communities on the west side. And so I tended to focus on the time that I spent in the north. I would go into Canoe Lake and north of there up to Île aux Crosses and other places that where DNR wasn't a particular problem, and that their policies and programs were much looser in these East Side communities. The East Side communities, the big shots were the priests. Sometimes fairly big shots were little local store owners or traders who'd come up from the south. The DNR officers were not a problem, and there was not a superimposition of structure around fish and furs and whatnot. But it was plain to Tommy that policies allowed Churchman at his own pace and with the budget he had to move into that west side gradually as he saw fit, which was a lot of why Tommy would urge me, keep talking to them, let them know what you want to do, bounce stuff off them. And we both resolved this is going to be very tippy-toe and very careful and unthreatening. We want to open communication here. So you got a little bit of the picture. One of another long arm that Tommy had into the North, he had helped establish the Center for Community Studies at the University of Saskatoon campus, and he had been part of selecting Bill Baker, an academic, and I'm not sure what, maybe he was a sociologist. He might have been an early political science guy, I don't know. But Bill was made the director of the Center for Community Studies, who employed a lot of academic people, not a lot, but he might have had a staff of 15 or 20 people, some of whom were very brilliant young anthropologists who, man, they impressed me right from the beginning. Men like Arthur K. Davis, with a PhD out of somewhere in America, he was a known communist. He was a brilliant researcher. Men like Michael Q, who was married to a Cree maiden, and Mike was an anthropologist of note that had come out of British Columbia. There were a couple of Métis guys that were employed in here, whose work I might mention somewhere else. But Baker had interesting research programs going on in the North frequently, and every once in a while he would run something by Tommy, and I was aware that a few months before this particular anecdote unfolds, Baker had come to Douglas and said, "Jesus, if I had the budget to do it, I see a way in which I could bring Peter Worsley from the University of Manchester, head of the Department of Anthropology there, a young, brilliant guy, bring him over for a couple of months of working with my staff and getting into some Saskatchewan problems." And Tommy had taken 10 seconds to say, "Yeah, do it, sounds great." And he was aware that Peter's big reputation had he had a publication and had spent a lot of time around the Melanesian cargo cult people. He had done a lot of work in some of those early anthropological areas, and he had been almost everywhere in the world. And the guy had a mind that could understand the subtleties of cultural differences, and he could smell out an organizational culture as quickly as he could come into a room and look around. Tommy had encouraged that appointment for a couple of months, and I had met Peter and watched him in a couple of training sessions with DNR people, and right away, like, hit it off with him. Here was somebody I wanted to spend time with. Well, I mentioned some of the anecdotes that came from DNR officers, like the one I mentioned, were interesting, but also interesting when these people, when a new chief would be appointed or came on through customs of inheritance or election or whatever it was, and we would hear about that, this guy would go on the list and would be invited to the next Federation meeting at Fort Capel, usually in the fall of the year. And we had a budget to have these guys picked up by Saskatchewan Government Airlines or by choppers or whatever all over the north. And there was this one fellow that had been brought out of the north for the first time, I think the year before I got there. And I don't know where, somewhere way north of Black Lake, where the uranium mines were in Uranium City and stuff. This guy had been appointed as a local honcho and was therefore invited to come to the hoopla down in Fort Capel. And he'd indicated he would like to do that. And when the moment came and the helicopter, or maybe it was an old beaver or something, came into the little tiny village that he was from to pick him up, he was not there. And the rumor was, well, he's out on his trap line because they were out of moose, and his family went with him, and he should be back any time. Well, this pilot realized, well, better go looking, and he got some idea of where this guy's territory was, and he flew around the territory, trapping territory, and he spotted this family down on the edge of a lake. A little fire going, and several children, and a couple were down there. So he thought, well, it's possible. So he landed, I think it was a beaver, he landed this thing in the lake and made inquiries, and sure enough, this was his man. And they were all huddled around the fire, and there was a huge big pot, a big iron pot, God knows where they'd got it or how much it weighed, but bubbling in it was a whole bunch of moose meat, and the carcass of the moose was sitting here. And the pilot says, well, I'm here to take you down to Prince Albert, and then we've got a bus or something that's going to take you down to Fort Capel. And the guy said, oh, well, I can't go now. We got moose. Why would I want to go anywhere? There's food here, and I'm with my family. And the pilot, who knew his way around, says, well, I guess we could take some of that moose with us. And the guy thought a moment and said, yeah, well, can we get that big pot into the airplane? Pilot, yeah, we'll have to cool it down a bit, but we could do that. So the guy's wife concurred, and the kids were all smiling, and they had all the rest of this moose meat there, and it wasn't all that far from the village. So they could camp out, and they had and they could take the remnant of the moose back to the village. So with the help of the pilot, this gentleman and the pilot took one half each of this big iron pot full of warm moose stew and all kinds of meat in there. It was going to last them quite a while, and they struggled to get it into the back of the beaver. Beaver took off, and this kind of thing to this pilot, nothing unusual going on here. So that he manages to land the thing down in PA, and they get help, and the big pot is loaded into the back of a taxi, and the taxi is told to take him into the Lincoln Hotel in Prince Albert. And this was where we usually house the people coming in from the north. Nothing unusual here. Taxi driver knows what's going on. So they take this big pot, they put it into the back. They can't close the trunk, but they drive into town, pull into the parking in front of the Lincoln, and the taxi driver realizes, well, a desk clerk in there looks kind of green. He's a new guy. I don't know whether, but he said to the gentleman from the north, well, look, you go in and register there, and then when they give you your room key and your room number, come out here and I'll help you. So the guy went in and he found a bilingual Cree in there, and he went to the front desk, and yes, they had a room in his name, and it was up on the third floor, second floor, facing onto the street. He got all registered. The bill comes to the province, and it's going to be 2 or 3 days before he leaves there to go down to Fort Qu'Appelle. So he comes out and shows the key to the cab driver, and the cab driver looks, and there's the desk clerk, you could see from the street, was sort of facing the other way, dealing with some other Indian people that had come in and were lined up at the desk. And the stairs to the upstairs are straight in from the main door. So the cab driver watches carefully, and then he says, now, and each of them take a handle of this thing. And they scurry up while the desk clerk is preoccupied, past the desk clerk, up the stairs to the second floor or wherever it was, open the door to this front room, and they look around, and the Indian notices the sink sitting there, but he'd never seen a sink before, a porcelain sink sitting there, and so he points, we could put it on there. So okay, they lift the thing and they dump it down on the sink. The cab driver goes away and wishes him luck, and the Indian guy looks around, and things are fine here, it's a new hunting ground, but never seen so many people in his life, and all these cars, holy man. But he's hungry, and he wonders where the wood is, and he looks around, he can't find wood anywhere. But he notices an old chair in the corner, and there's some newspapers around, so he stuffs a bunch of newspaper into the underside in this sink, which he assumes is where you light your fire. He pushes in a bunch of pieces of the chair, and he has some matches. He lights the match, and he opens the transom, and the smoke comes pouring out, and his stew is starting to warm. He's sitting by the fire, and the transom is wide open, and everything is going just fine. And then suddenly he hears a lot of noise and consternation down on the street, and he goes to the window and he looks down, and there's people down there pointing up at the smoke, and he doesn't pay much attention. But soon this big fire engine rolls up with the siren going, and he still doesn't get it. And the firemen come running up the stairs, come bursting into the room, and with disbelief, they see what's going on here, and they get their fire extinguishers out, and to the great consternation of the hunter, they put his fire out, and yeah, there's a little bit of warmth here, but not as much, and it is explained to him in Cree, no, you can't do that inside of the hotel rooms here. And the fireman realizes the guy's first time south, and and Prince Albert in those days was full of such stories. Anyway, he gets the message. A few days later, he stashes the big pot with the Lincoln Hotel manager, who puts it down in the basement till he comes back. And he arrives by bus in Fort Qu'Appelle, and the story it becomes legend. Wonderful story. All right. You got a little sense. All right, that some of those babblings, some of those couple of anecdotes maybe provide a little sense of the North. I got some other babblings about flying into the North. I had a pilot's license that I was pretty green with a Cessna, but I flew some strange things out of Regina. Those would be for another time as well. All right, so one day, Mr. Douglas is on the phone, and this would be, I'm guessing, maybe 6 months after I started to report to Tom. And the rapport was grand. We were on hold in terms of lots of things that we saw that we wanted to do, but it was becoming more and more clear what our objectives were, and lots of discussions about the process. How is this going to happen in a way that does not threaten, in a way that moves cautiously but in the direction of pretty radical change, particularly in the north. And Tom and I were beginning to envision a separate agency, a separate single agency that would handle all of the north, that would be in community development terms, like all its terms would be developmental. The origination of whatever happened in this project that we had in mind, this north we had in mind, the ideas would originate from the people, in the terms that we were hearing were the thought forms of the people as these came into the meetings of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians. We envisioned slowly moving toward a culture in the north that was not moving from Regina and Saskatoon down into the north, but was moving ideas and activity and projects from the grassroots places in a way that would evolve and create and change structures of the administration. Okay, so I get a phone call. Please come up here. I need to talk to you right away. And I dropped what I was doing and hustled into the Premier's office like a good lad, and Tommy's looking pretty serious. And he says, listen, this morning I had a cabinet meeting, and I kind of knew this was coming, but I hadn't expected it for a while. With leadership from a couple of the ministers, one of them being the Minister of Municipal Affairs, of Natural Resources, who was Kuziak at that time, and the Minister of Cooperatives. They pretty well joined forces to persuade the cabinet to make a move on the east side, and the decision is being made by the cabinet to consider for a week whether or not we expropriate weight fisheries on the east side of the province. At which point I kind of gasp, and I realize no wonder Tom looked serious, because if the DNR and cooperatives moved the fish marketing services into the west side, it would be game up for a lot of interesting little experiments that were happening there, and it would incorporate the structures of the Department of Natural Resources, and the east it would kind of solidify them, and from my point of view a lot of ground would be lost in a way. So Tom says, I've stalled it off, and the cabinet are meeting again in about 10 days, and they are going to make that determination at that point. But I can see, looking around the cabinet, that unless I become dogmatic about the whole thing, it looks as though weight fisheries are going to be expropriated very quickly, and that move is going to be made sometime in the next month. have you got any suggestions? And I said, yeah, could you ask me to do a little quickie report back to you on the work of Len Waite and his fish company, in terms that would give you a look at what's happening there now, and that would help you to take your own stand in that cabinet meeting. And Tom says, yeah, well, that's what I was kind of hoping. How do we go at that? And I said, well, you've already started work on it. What do you mean? Well, if I can go up north and I can spend a week working on that, I can get back to you within the required period of time. But I would like to go with Peter Worsley. And Tom broke into a grin. He said, oh, great idea. I think I can arrange that. And very quickly he picks up the phone, has Bill Baker on the phone from Center for Community Studies, and says, I got a little problem up on the east side, and I need somebody to go up there and do some research for a few days, and he'd accompany Ray up there. Could you spring Peter loose from whatever he's doing? And Baker, sensing this was something pretty important, said, absolutely. I'll talk to him right away and I'll phone you back within 5 minutes. So in the next 5 minutes, the phone came back from Baker saying, yeah, he can be ready to go at any time. He can shake loose and postpone some things and have Ray get a hold of him, and away we go. So I phoned Peter an hour or two later and said, listen, I don't know how, there's no scheduled flights up there. There's no way to get there other than to become trappers and start walking. I've got a little bit of budget that I can apply, but not a lot. Let's just see if we can use our good luck and our prayers and our intuitive skills to get us into the north and have a look at what's happening up there throughout Waite's projects. Well, Peter had already familiarized himself with a little bit with Waite Fisheries. He knew the story there. Great, that's fine with me. Do we need food? No, we don't need food. We can mooch our way anywhere. That's never a problem, but we do need a couple of 4-star sleeping bags. We need lots of mosquito dope, and we need lots of whatever's going to keep the fleas down at night. And as long as you got lots of socks and some heavy clothes, we're set. And I pick you up in the government car out of your office tomorrow morning. So early the next morning, I get Peter and sleeping bags thrown into the back of the government car, and we start heading north. We went to Prince Albert, made a sharp left down the road, and headed down toward the name of the community, Big River. And Big River, Saskatchewan was where Waite Fisheries had its head office and its warehouses and its fish plant, and its operation for the east side was well established, because I don't remember anymore. Len had been in there working for 10 or more years. He had a son, an older son, who was his partner in the business, partner or manager, whatever it was. They had a couple of airplanes, and they worked out of Big River, where there was a lake adjoining their office, and they would fly off and on that lake.
Do you feel like taking a break now?
Yeah.
Okay, and then keeping your exact.
Ooh, this has got a long introduction. Maybe we can make it a short story. And it is all about Tommy. We're forgetting about him in here. So next morning early, I picked Peter Worsley up in Saskabush and throw her stuff in the trunk of the car and start heading straight up to Prince Albert. And then we turn west toward Big River, which is the headquarters of Waite Fisheries. And then in my mind, we were going to proceed up to Meadow Lake, talk to a few people up there who had a little sense of what was going on north of Meadow Lake. And then we were going to go north another 100 some odd miles to Canoe Lake and talk to some fishermen there. And then I figured we might rent a canoe and somebody would operate it and go up the old Peter Pond River route to haul us up to Isla Crosse and see where it went from there. This was kind of on my mind. On the way, Peter is asking, what the hell is this all about, and what are we doing here, and what are we working at, what are we up to? And I loved his questions. I liked the shortcut it was possible to talk with him. He had obviously been everywhere, done everything, and there were no surprises in any of this for him. And he was delighted with the assignment. I commented a couple of times, wow, this is better than the academic life. Like I can hardly wait to get my ears into this and my eyes into this as we go north. En route, I thought perhaps at Big River, there might be an opportunity to just tour that fish plant, maybe listen to anything anybody there had to say, get a little sense of what was happening there at the headquarters, at least to be able to describe that setup to Tommy. So I came over the hill on the way down into Big River and looked down as we come over as the road tops out and we approach, and there is the lake, and beside the lake is the head office of Waite Fisheries, and out on the end of the lake I noticed a six-place Cessna just warming up, about to take off. And I thought, ooh, I wonder, and I put my foot on the gas and we skidded to a stop in front of the office, and I dove in the door and just on impulse started shouting at the girl, "Who's out there in the airplane?" And she responded, "Oh, that's Len Waite." "Where's he going?" "He's just going north." "Oh, would you ask him whether there's room to take a couple of idiots north with him? We were going to take the long, slow canoe route. We want to just go up the west side and look around, and tell him I'm working out of the Premier's office, and is there any chance at all we can mooch a ride or pay for a ride north?" She looks at me and rolls her eyes and grabs the radio transmitter, and pretty soon Lynn is responding, and she spells it out. Yeah, I'll give those jokers a ride. I'll be right in. I got lots of room here. Nobody else in the plane. So I got the car out of the way, and we took her stuff down to the little dock, and a minute later in comes the Cessna, and we throw the stuff in. And the two of us get in, and I'm sitting by Len up the front, and we just do the howdies, and he knows enough to he knows enough to know that anybody out of the Premier's office is not good news for him. He knows enough to know that one of these days there's going to be a move afoot to expropriate his business. He knows that. Nobody has to talk about it. He is aware that these are not his political buddies in any sense, but he's very welcoming and very pleased to meet this guy from University of Manchester, and he and I hit it off right away because we both love airplanes, and Len explains, I've got 5 or 6 days of meetings with groups of my fishermen all up the east side to talk about fish prices for this year and to talk about our fishing strategies for this year. Where are we going to fish? Where are we not going to fish? What kind of volumes of which species do we want? What are their prices going to be? And it's simply to provide them with information and get feedback from them. And if you're interested in having a look at these communities where I'm going, I'm sure that you're very welcome to just traipse along with me from meeting to meeting if you like. I don't know what you're going to be doing out there. Peter responded, well, I don't know either. I just want a little, a greenhorn's look at the north of Saskatchewan. And that's all I want to do, and that'll do just fine, sir, if there's some way that we can compensate you for the tour. And Wade is laughing, saying, no way, it's my privilege, and we're going to get to know one another pretty well during the week. And by the way, I'm having dinner with somebody or other tonight in Ile Cross, and I'm sure you're welcome to come along. Okay, we're on. We've got supper found already. And away we go. First place we sat down was Ile Croix, and an hour later, there's a little meeting of fishermen out in a clearing out at the edge of town. It was outdoors, and these guys are just hanging around, sitting on a few logs and stumps, and we pulled in kind of out of sight, and Len just in behind, but it was clear to everybody we weren't there to participate. Len moves in and he provides information. He makes his, I don't think the word is requests, and it's certainly not information. He makes his demands in terms of what he expects out of these guys in terms of volumes of fish and in terms of their fitting into his scheme of which lakes they're going to work and which lakes they're going to go easy on, because he's very conscious of conservation and stocks and all those kinds of problems that the Department of Natural Resources on the other side of the province have many people looking at. Len lays it on him in a very directive fashion, and I'm aware, geez, this guy's coming on strong and dogmatic, but every one of them seemed to appreciate this. There's no reaction to anything he's saying. They're asking him questions. They're asking him questions respectfully, as though they were dealing with somebody that knew more about their fishing business than they did. They're curious about markets and what he knows about all that, and he's doing an educational job filling them in. The feeling throughout the meeting is just very cooperative, and a sense of working with is there on the part of everybody. And Peter and I look at one another every once in a while and raise our eyebrows and kind of go, wow, and looking at the way in which Len will field a question or he will deal with whatever's going on. So all right, we hang around, and when the meeting's over, I get to chat with some of these guys, a couple of whom I'd met before down at Fort Capel, and Peter meets others, and we chat about how their life as fishermen is going, how much money they're making and not making, what their problems are in terms of boats and nets and fish and all that stuff. And nobody's making notes, but we sure make them later in the evening when we fill up our notebooks and have a little sense of what's happening here. Len takes us off to somebody's home where we have a great feed of fish for supper, and then there's an invitation to sleep at somebody's place, and maybe two places, and away we go with our sleeping bags, and early in the morning we're back in the plane and we're going on to the next. And over the next 6 or 7 days, that scene repeats itself again and again and again. Wherever we go, it's the same thing. The people are expecting Wade. They've had a message on the radio. They've come in to gather. They're looking forward to this. And there's the same sense of appreciation and interest and curiosity, acceptance on the part of everybody. And there's a sense of satisfaction that comes out of this meeting. We know where we're at now. And Peter and I are expanding our notes and our sense of what's happening here, and noticing that the invitations are coming from all directions. Come and have lunch or dinner or whatever it is at my place, and hey, you can bunk over there, and da-da-da. And it turns out to be an amazing week as it unfolds. And we keep looking at one another, and Jesus, how could a project open up any easier than this one? It's just amazing. but also aware that we've got to have something that grabs the guts of these cabinet members. There's got to be something that's appealing on some basis other than common sense. There isn't always a lot of that afoot in a cabinet meeting or a caucus meeting or a member of any number of kinds of activities where these things might be considered. And that emotional wow really isn't there anywhere yet. Peter recognized it, so do I. However, we get a growing sense of at least our own view of our own recommendations about what ought to be happening or not happening here. Finally, end of trip. See how quickly that happened? End of trip, and we're in the plane and we're on our way back to Big River. And Len looks at us, and by now we're damn good friends. We've got a real sense of rapport with the three of us around the thing. And he's saying, listen, you guys aren't leaving tonight. My woman is away right now, and I'm batching for several weeks. I've got some nice big beef steak that I brought in that's in my freezer. And I've got a nice bottle of scotch up there. And you're going to come up to my place tonight, and you got comfortable beds with mattresses and heat and no bugs, and you're going to stay the night. It's late already. It was almost supper time. So come on up for supper, and I won't take no for an answer. I've been hauling you around all week. Now I get to enjoy your company. Okay? Well, so we arrive, and out comes the booze. And after several drinks, out come the steaks. And they are fantastic. This guy is a cook like he's a pilot. He knows how to handle steaks in airplanes. And people out of the Premier's office. And there hasn't been a word about this agenda anywhere or about the problem of weight fisheries in the province, not a mention. After dinner, another couple of drinks, we're sitting there, and Len looks at us, and suddenly his mood changes, and he says, all right, you guys have heard how all the Indian people up there think about and plan around our activities, and you've obviously been very interested in that, and I'm sure it's an essential part of everything that's going up the west side. And it's been really neat to see how interested you were to listen and record here and there. But I want to tell you why I'm there, and that's another story. This is not just a financial activity for you. Can you stand a personal narrative? Well, yeah. And he starts in with a tale that I'm not going to repeat. A personal story of some dilemmas that he was writing in at the point where he first was setting up this little fishing and fish marketing business. And then he gave us some stories about his early interactions with the Cree people on that side and some of the understandings that he began to discover within himself. And then finally, after a while, as he got into this, he just put his head down and the tears are flowing and he's sobbing and he's saying, hell, I'm trying to cover it up with a lot of words. What I'm trying to say is these people showed me what love means, taught me how to love. I had no idea. I was head bound. My life turned around in the early months that I was here. And I'm here because I resolved that I owed them a debt, and I'm here paying my debt. And they're repaying me every day. Like the emotional maturity and mystery and wisdom of these people is uncanny. And that curiosity is the one that satisfies me. That's the one that keeps me here. And I just thought I wanted to share that with you. And gruffly, okay, the beds are over there. Peter and I looked at one another and said, oh God, yeah, this is what we need. So we leave Big River in the morning, and Peter says, what can I do? And I say, Peter, you can screw off. I'll take you home. And many, many thanks. I'm going to keep in touch with you. I'm not going to try to record anything. I'm going to go have a little chat with Tommy in the morning. And Peter laughs and says, yeah, I got it. So next morning I appeared in the Premier's office, and he's looking at me, well, we've got this cabinet meeting tomorrow afternoon. Have you got anything for me? Well, Tommy, I don't know. Let me tell you, first of all, about our sense of this routine of meetings that we went to. And I described these annual sessions that Len had with his fishermen and how that came off, and compared it, and I'm not going to get into that here, with the kind of activity that I would watch go on in the name of co-op fisheries on the other side of the world, the northern world. And totally different. In a way, yeah, Len is more dogmatic, more bureaucratic, more top-down than any of those guys in the DNR. But in another way, he's fundamentally listening and they know it. He's fundamentally working for them and they know it. He's offering them information that he's carefully researched and they need, and they know it. And there's a rapport there that just hums along. And Tommy's looking at me with that glazed look, and because he realizes this is not what, I'm not sure he can sell us either. And then finally I looked at him and I said, Tom, it's kind of like that first meeting that when I came in here, you and I ended up with our heads down on the desk and the tears and laughter flowing. Let me tell you about last night. And I spelled out the steak and I spelled out the scotch, and he's looking at me. And then I got down to the punchline, you know, and gave him a little bit of the information that Len had laid out. This is what solved my life, solved my crisis many years ago. And in those hours of insight, I learned what loving was all about. And that's why I'm there. I kind of recapped the scene to him. Tom looked at me all misty-eyed. And he said, kind of repeated what I'd said to Peter. He just said, you know, I can handle this. I don't need anything more. And I thank you. You've done a great job up there. And I'm here to prophesy right now that we shall not be expropriating white fishery for the next little while. He said, you give me enough ammo that I can go in there steamed up, and that ain't going to happen right now, even although there seems to be a majority of the cabinet that would at this moment be inclined to go that way. But these guys are listening too. And pretty nice. You know, I had needed that kind of a boss over in adult education, needed that kind of rapport, needed that kind of sensitivity. How else can you work in organization? And with Tom, that was always there, and when it came right down to it, there was an emotional gut level involvement that had a great deal to do with any major decision that was made. Well, I guess that's the end of that particular little narrative.